I'm delighted to be here with you today. I want to thank Dr. Warren for her invitation, and I'm honored to be a part of this conversation with New York Theological Seminary. You know, we gather today against the backdrop of a nation on a knife's edge. The divisions within the country, white, black, rural, urban, rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, are in full view. And it feels as if the institutions and norms of our democracy are collapsing right in front of our bloodshot eyes. We've experienced an imperial presidency out of control. The People's House, the House of Representatives, been stymied by hyperpartisanship. The Senate has been broken. We've even witnessed the politicization of the military and the courts. But more important than that is that COVID-19 ravages the country. Americans die alone, and those who love them must grieve with the regret of not being able to say goodbye properly. The economy is in tatters. Millions are unemployed and hunger grips the nation, but the top 1% thrives. They are getting richer as death travels from door to door. You combine all of that with the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the police killing of Trayford Pillarin in Lafayette, Louisiana, the public lynching of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, the death of Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia. They called for an ambulance and they sent the police. And now his mother grieves. We've seen people in the streets, and people continue to protest in the streets, and they're protesting what has been obvious to many of us for generations, that in this country, supposedly committed to the basic principles of democracy, the lives of Black people are less valued than others. We face a moral reckoning, a fundamental challenge to what we mean by we the people, to how we conceive of being together. No election will answer that question. In a time where a global pandemic is killing people indiscriminately in this country, especially Black and brown people, where our economy has collapsed and those who have the luxury of working from home or who are making money hand over fist demand that some of us, the most vulnerable among us, go back to work and serve them. When people can't pay their bills, their rent, put food on the table, and the planet is screaming because we are killing it, we see our folk, engaged in the haunting public ritual of Black grief. We have to watch videos over and over again of Black death, of Black suffering. All on a perpetual loop. And we hear the weeping of those who have lost loved ones at the hands of the police. And this is happening against the backdrop of a political season. The ghost of the country's racist past now haunt out in public, right? They hunt out in the open. Political partisanship in this country is firmly connected to deep racial divisions. We see this as politicians exploit white fear and grievance and resentment for their own political gain. And in the face of what has been, by any measures, a disastrous first term, we still saw a large number of Americans applauding Donald Trump and his minions. In so many ways, the American idea is in trouble. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today we confront the ugliness of who we are, and that ugliness isn't just about who occupies the White House or murderous police officers or loud racists screaming horrible things. And I have to remind you of this. It is actually the images of children in cages with mucus smeared shirts and soiled pants glaring back at us. Parents separated from their children after risking everything to come here only because they believe in the idea. 545 children permanently separated, it seems, from their parents. That's evil. It is Oscar Ramirez and his 23-month-old baby or daughter. We have to call their names face down, washed up on the banks of our shores. All of this has happened, is happening in the name of the American idea. Now, I sat down as all of this was unfolding, and is unfolding. I found myself, as I sat down, struggling with despair. The country had done it again. It had betrayed us, and the euphoria of the election of the first Black president and the direct declarations that we had turned a corner were met with the venom of Trump's presidency. And you know what? We've been here before, as I've said. We've had a chance to be otherwise, and the nation doubled down on its ugliness. You think about the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, what historians call the Second Founding. And here we see the formation of the modern US nation state, the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted Black folks citizenship, which untethered citizenship from the idea of whiteness, the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the vote, right? We see all of this as part of the Second Founding, the formation of the modern US nation state. But all of this went along with the sedimentation of Jim Crow in the South. Frederick Douglass lived long enough to see Abraham Lincoln sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and he lived long enough to see the state of Mississippi pass the first Jim Crow laws. It's during this period that we see the conscription of Black labor through policing and criminal convict leasing that led to cities like Birmingham being built. It's during this period that we see the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism defining the value of white people over against all others, of certain kinds of white people, and justifying and in some ways serving as the motivational force for the imperial ambition of the US nation state as it moved out into the world. The very moment in which the country was consolidating a racial regime in the South, it was annexing places like the Philippines and bringing millions of Black and brown people under its rule. America's export is not just simply baseball, it's white supremacy. And it's not just a Southern story either. At the moment in which we reached for a different way of being as a nation, to be a truly multiracial democracy, the country doubled down on its ugliness. It doubled down on the belief that white people mattered more than others. And the same thing happened in the mid-20th century. The Black freedom struggle demanded broad-based inclusion, and historians refer to this period as the Second Reconstruction, an attempt to make real the promises, the broken promises of the first. And what did we get in response? We got calls for law and order, which put in place the cornerstone of what would become the carceral state. We got the tax revolt in California, which laid the foundation for the shredding of the social safety net, a wholesale attack on the basic fundamentals of the New Deal. We saw in 1968 and 72 the election of Richard Nixon, designed to defend the so-called forgotten Americans, the so-called silent majority. And by 1980, we see the election of Ronald Reagan. At the very moment in which the nation reached for a different way of being in the world, it doubled down on its ugliness. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected. And what do we get? We got the vitriol of the Tea Party, the voter ID laws and voter suppression, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. What do we get? We got the election of Donald Trump. At every turn, when we have faced the kind of moral reckoning we now face, we have doubled down on our ugliness. It is in light of this that I found myself struggling with despair and rage. And when rage and despair mix, all hell can break loose. In the midst of struggling with my despair and rage, I reached for James Baldwin for resources to help me understand how to pick up the pieces. And and how to continue to struggle in light of America's ongoing betrayal. Baldwin insisted that the country confront the lie that sustains its innocence. As he put it in The Fire Next Time, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime, a kind of willful ignorance that protects this lie about oneself. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lies that America told itself. In Nothing Personal, an essay he wrote in 1964 to accompany the photographs of Richard Avedon, Baldwin put the point succinctly: we are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. He says, we live by lies. We live by lies. And not only, for example, about race, but also about our very natures. He says, the lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our heart. This country has never been a beacon of virtue. The country has never been an example of democracy achieved. It's not the shining city on the hill. We tell ourselves these lies in order to protect ourselves from what we have done. Baldwin understood that our problem in the United States went beyond who occupied the White House or the latest example of American racism. We had to get to the rot at the heart of the matter, he insisted. And this would require that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred, tell the truth so that we might be released into a different way of being in the world. Now, how do we keep fighting when the times seem so dark? How do we muster the energy and courage to keep pushing this damn boulder up the hill? Baldwin had to ask himself those questions. America consistently betraying us. Every generation having to grapple with the reality of having to bury our dead too soon. Every generation having to witness white America walk across our dead with no care or compunction, right? We have to deal with our own sorrow and pain, and now it's on loop. Videos that come back to haunt. Baldwin had to come to terms with what happened to the Black freedom struggle in such a short period of time. He had to deal with the fact that they killed an apostle of love, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he lost it. He collapsed. In 1969, he tried to commit suicide. He was so vulnerable and so fragile, and he had to work hard to figure out the angry cries of Black power, to find language to describe the white fantasy that was Ronald Reagan. He had to tell the truth, even as cancer ravaged his body. And here we are today, where the forces unleashed by the latest version of the American fantasy and by those who cleave to the idea of being white and menaced by those who are not, that fantasy threatened, as it has always and as they have always done, it threatens to destroy the very foundation of the country. Baldwin responded to these moments with love. He insisted that love was the key. In an interview with Nazir Bayum in Istanbul in 1969, with Black power blazing across the country and throughout the Black diaspora, Jimmy's emphasis on love returned. He wrote, if only people could trust the thing, they would be less afraid of being touched, less afraid of loving each other, less afraid of being changed by each other. life would be different. Our children would not be the victims that they are now. We would not be either. But for some reason, love is the most frightful thing, he writes. Something that the human being is most in need of and dreads most. Now, this view of love remained consistent across the body of Baldwin's work. It was woven together with his rejection of categorization and its threat to overwhelm the complexity of who we actually are. Baldwin made the point explicitly in that same interview. He said, quote, like all poets, I am full with the question of how the human being will be put to the right. Isn't that beautiful? I am full with the question of how the human being will be put to the right. You know, it is for this reason that all this black, white, Armenian, Turkish, Greek, Jewish, et cetera, never carried any meaning for me. The question is how to fix ourselves. The question is how to fix ourselves, give birth to ourselves, to make us live free of all these swaddling clothes, free of all of these habits. Love becomes the crucible within which we reach for a different way of being together. And this we can see as early as 1963 with Baldwin's Fire Next Time, right? Remember that moment in Fire Next Time? He says, it is for this reason, because we're evading who we are. We don't want to confront the lie. We don't want to confront the lies that we tell ourselves. He says, it is for this reason that love is so desperately sought and so cunningly avoided. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. And he says, I use the word love here, not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace, not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. Baldwin understood what love meant. And here, he's not just talking about agape, right? He's also talking about eros and philia, right? All three elements of the Greek understanding of love. Think about that moment at the end of Fire Next Time where he says, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on to create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now. We may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. He says, like lovers. Like lovers. What does he mean? That moment of vulnerability, that moment of being fragile, that moment in which we understand that we are in need of others, that moment when our suffering becomes the bridge to another's suffering, that moment when our pain allows us to be open to the pain of the world. And as we grapple with our suffering and pain, as we do so in love, we open up the possibility of being otherwise. But the precondition for all of this to happen is that you have to tell the truth about what you've done. You have to confront one's ghastly failures. And not only do you have to do that individually, but for Baldwin, you have to do that for the nation. The nation has to do it. In 1962, Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. The article was an extended meditation on the role of a new generation of writers, among whom Baldwin was fast emerging as a leading voice. You know, he's thinking about Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Faulkner. These were writers that are sacrosanct, or still are actually sacrosanct, and often served as a standard to judge the adequacy of the young generation of writers. The past full of these giants, Baldwin suggested, was used to bludgeon the present, replete with those who inevitably fall short. Now, I mention this not to engage in an analysis of Baldwin's somewhat impious engagement with the American literary canon. Rather, it is what he says about the role of the artist. And here he echoes Emerson's view of the poet that strikes me as particularly relevant for our moment. Baldwin wrote, quote, The effort to become a great artist or a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. Mm. To tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more. We must, as Baldwin wrote, deal with what words hide and what they reveal. Now, this is all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories obscure the horrors of what we've done and ensure our sense of innocence and inherent goodness. Telling the truth here, especially in the dark times like our own, requires a certain kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety and comfort and protect the order of things. It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release ourselves into a new way of being together. This will entail at times a withering criticism of the past that haunts and constrains, a scathing critique of our self-conception. What am I trying to suggest here? Baldwin says that the American project is predicated upon lies. That we have told ourselves these lies about what we've done in order to protect our innocence, to keep us from confronting our ghastly failures. And what does that mean? That means that we have in some ways become monstrous in some ways, right? But how does he respond? He not only responds by telling the truth, telling as much truth as we can bear, but he also understands that we must tell that truth in love, right? A love rooted in our own suffering and pain, because the suffering and pain becomes the bridge to others that allows both of us, right, in some ways, to imagine ourselves differently. This is Baldwin's ethic, it seems to me. This is his moral stance. But it requires, right, an unflinching honesty about who we are, about who and what white America, who and what these people take themselves to be. As Baldwin put it, quote, "We live in a country in which words are mostly used to cover the sleeper, not to waken him. And therefore, it seems to me the adulation so cruelly proffered our elders has nothing to do with their achievement, but has to do with our impulse to look back on what we imagine to have been a happier time. It is an adulation which has panic at the root." Baldwin is unsparing in his criticism. He goes on to say that, quote, "One hears in the work of all of American novelists, even including the mighty Henry James, songs of the plains, the memory of a virgin continent mysteriously despoiled, though all dreams were to have become possible here. This did not happen, and the panic then to which I've referred comes out of the fact that we are now confronting the awful question of whether or not all of our dreams have failed. How have we managed to become what we have in fact become," he asks. "And if we are indeed, as we seem to be, so empty and desperate, what are we to do about it? This longing for a happier time, a kind of nostalgia, allows us to turn our heads away from the difficulty of our days. We want to make America great again, or we pine for the days before our current misery, as if America's loss of innocence is a recent event, or as if the issue is the loss of innocence at all." Baldwin insisted that we have to ask ourselves the hard questions that get us to the heart of the matter. How shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? How shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? He understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involved what we tell ourselves about Black and white people, that white people ought to be valued more in this country than others. And he witnessed the monstrous consequences of what followed from this view in terms of our dispositions and practices. Baldwin insisted, and it is an insistence that we must follow if we are to survive our own darkness, that, quote, "We must describe us to ourselves as we now are." We must describe us to ourselves as we now are. Tell the truth. This formulation allows us to see the work of the poet in describing things as they are. We have to be poets. We have to bear witness, and we must do so in love. Now, America has to choose We have to choose whether it will finally become, America has to choose, we have to choose whether we will finally become a genuinely multiracial democracy. And this involves grappling with the past that continues to haunt our present living. That George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Walter Wallace, these are simply the latest victims of the slave codes that have shaped the way Black communities are policed in this country. That we have to tell the truth about the wealth gap and the achievement gap and the disparities in healthcare, that we have to tell the truth about who we are. As Baldwin wrote, quote, "The trouble is deeper than we think." I love this line. The trouble is deeper than we wish to think because the trouble is in us. And we will never, ever establish human communities, he writes. We will never establish human community until we stare our ghastly failure in the face, end quote. This is a challenge we all must take up. You know we all stand on a knife's edge. That the background conditions that make our world possible have cracked. We have to grapple in the aftermath of this election with the reality of our dead. Over 220,000 Americans dead. And our numbers, Black folks and brown folks, are disproportionately represented in that number. And many have had to die alone without loved ones holding their hand. As a nation, we're going to have to confront the reality of our dead, because for the last 4 years, we have not, the last 2 years, the last year, over the month, over the span of this pandemic, we have turned in so many ways a blind eye, at least a blind national eye, to the reality of the suffering that's happening in our communities. Walt Whitman had to grapple with the dead of the Civil War. We have to grapple with our dead. We have to grapple with the loneliness that follows, the sense of regret that follows from the fact that we couldn't honor the life properly, that some couldn't sit ship, that we couldn't have the wake, we couldn't have the proper home going, that the folks in New Orleans couldn't march the second line, that we couldn't say goodbye. So our grief is tinged with regret. And we have to grapple with the reality of selfishness in this moment. It has been revealed over the course of this pandemic, over the course of this crisis, that the country is in the grips of selfishness. And I'm reminded of this wonderful line that Bishop Curry said to me, and he writes in his book, The Way is Love, right? That is, that love, the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is selfishness. And we have been awash in selfishness. So much so that for a large percentage of Americans, that to put on one's mask, right, is somehow an infringement upon liberty. Oh, the trouble that we face is so much deeper than we think, because the trouble is in us. We have to live our way into a different way of being together, a different way of doing our work together. That means committing ourselves to building a country that affirms the dignity and sacrality of every human being, no matter the color of their skin, their zip code, who they love, their gender or ability. It must involve a revolution of value, a shift in what and who we value. It must involve an ongoing and devastating, a scathing criticism of the very idea of white America. That idea isn't redeemable. There's nothing redeemable about the view that white people matter more than others, but that doesn't mean we are irredeemable. In order for this to happen, we have to tell ourselves the truth about our failures, but we have to do so in love. We have to take the risk to do something bold and visionary. In the end, we all have been birthed in the American fantasy of itself as an example of democracy achieved. That fantasy has distorted and disfigured our moral sense because it requires that we lie to ourselves about what we've done. And the lie that thrives on a kind of willful ignorance makes this place, it makes us monstrous. I believe it is our task today to do exactly what Baldwin called for in 1962 and 1987. In 62, he wrote, quote, "We have to mount an unending attack on all that Americans believe themselves to hold sacred. It is to unmask panic at the root." In some ways, the presidential election came at the right time, at a time of moral reckoning. But I pray that we do not trade one fantasy for another, that Trump's defeat will somehow affirm America's inherent goodness and put a grateful republic back to sleep. Presidential elections alone, no matter how momentous, do not settle the question of who we take ourselves to be. The answer to that question will emerge in what we do after November. Now we must, in this moment, we must risk everything, everything. America is broken. Young Americans know this. They've come of age and amid catastrophe, and they know the country is fundamentally broken. Some reach for progressive politics, others turn to authoritarianism or fascism. They're reaching for languages that can help them make sense of what the American fantasy with its particular words have hidden and concealed. But Baldwin is right. He was right. Quote, "Our own record must be read. The record must be read." The air of this time and place is so heavy with rhetoric, he writes, so thick with soothing lies, that one must really do great violence to language. One must somehow disrupt the comforting beat in order to be heard. And this is particularly true for Christians. Particularly true in this moment that has revealed the hypocrisy of those who traffic in the gospel so that they can walk the corridors of power. Baldwin understood the hypocrisy at its root. In the midst of him grappling with the anger of black power, the devastation of the betrayal that was Ronald Reagan, he saw clearly who the moral majority was. He understood what it meant for these particular folk to sacralize power in the way that they did. And so he penned one of his last essays entitled "To Crush a Serpent." To crush a serpent. And there he challenged, right, those who would in some ways embrace the gospel to live it in light of a robust conception of the sacrality of every human being. Because Jimmy understood that if we dared to create ourselves anew, we needed to do something unprecedented. And that is to create a self without the need for enemies, as he put it. I want to read a passage from "To Crush a Serpent," because I think it's important to our moments and to your ministries. He says, salvation is not flight from the wrath of God. It is accepting and reciprocating the love of God. Salvation is not separation. It is the beginning of union with all that is or has been or will ever be. Those who want to scorn LGBTQ community, those who want to scorn Black and brown folk, those who want to scorn immigrant labor, those who want to scorn Black and brown people, those who want to scorn those folk who are different than them. They imagine God's love evidenced in separation. Baldwin says salvation is not found there. Salvation is as real, as mighty, and as impersonal as the rain, he says, and it is yet as private as the rain in one's face. Salvation repudiates condemnation. He says, since we all have the right for many reasons to condemn one another, condemnation is easier than wonder and obliterates the possibility of salvation. He says, I'm speaking as the historical victim of the flames meant to exorcise the terrors of the mob, and I'm also speaking as an actual potential victim. Those ladders to fire, the burning of the witch, the heretic, the Jew, the faggot, the N-word, have always failed to redeem or even to change in any way whatever the mob. They merely force their connection on the only plane on which the mob can meet. The charred bones connect its members and give them a reason to speak to one another. But the charred bones are the sum total of their individual self-hatred. Externalized, the burning or lynching or torturing gives them something to talk about. They dare no other subject, certainly not the forbidden subject of the bloodstained self. They dare not trust one another. End quote. He says, what we are witnessing, what we are watching with the Falwells and Robertsons is an attempt to exercise ourselves. Into crush the serpent, right? Baldwin is trying to offer an understanding of love and salvation that frees us up from the categories that distort and disfigure the soul, that frees us up from this desire to scapegoat that leads to this unseemly death, these unseemly rituals, right? To in some ways consolidate a particular community that feels under threat. What does it mean to love in this moment? What does it mean to call out the hypocrisy of those who claim the gospel in this moment? It means to tell the truth as much as one could bear and a little bit more. It means to stand on the power of love in all of its complexity, not sentimentality. It means to risk everything in this moment. Everything. Baldwin wrote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Such powerful words for our country and for you, pastors, for you, educators, for you. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges and leave the old frame intact. We must shake loose from the shibboleths of the past and their gods and begin again. No matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility right now. No matter who's in the White House. No matter who's in the White House, we have some fundamental work to do. As Baldwin put it in Just Above My Head, responsibility isn't lost, it's abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, then one begins again. Let's begin again right here, right now. Let's risk everything to finally put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. Let's understand what Baldwin meant by salvation and to crush a serpent. This is going to require something extraordinary from us. It's going to require white America to rid itself of the insidious belief that they ought to be valued more than others. And that will be hard work. It's going to require us to be courageous in resisting it all. But as Baldwin says, human beings are at once miracles and disasters. I love that. We are at once miracles and disasters. If we show up, If we risk ourselves in this moment, we at least have a chance for a miracle. We at least have a chance for a miracle. Take care. I appreciate you.